हेलो।
ज्योत्सना ऊपर चढ़ जाओ, हाँ क्योंकि फीडबैक दे दो।
Good evening, everyone. Thank you all for coming today, this evening. We are gathered here to observe 100 years since the Shimla Agreement, which was initially between British India, Tibet, and China. And I think it is very symbolic today that we're having this conversation with Indians and Tibetans. We have two Tibetan speakers here. Lobsang Yeshi, who is a member of the Tibetan Parliament in exile. Divyesh Anand, who's a professor at the London Westminster University. And Tenzin Sundu, who's an activist and a writer. The Shimla Convention, or the Shimla Agreement, which was in 1913-1914, but we celebrated 100 years this month, because this month was when the famous McMahon Line was drawn. At that time, China had stepped back, so it was between British India representative and Tibetan representative. Today we are here to also see and discuss the significance of the Shimla Agreement for India and Tibet and China today. We know that the India-China border dispute is one of the longest border crises, and I believe that one of the reasons why it has not been able to find a lasting solution is fundamentally because Tibet has not been discussed. Tibet plays a very important role in this discussion. And without saying much further, I open the floor to our speakers. They will each speak for 10 to 15 minutes, and then we'll open the floor to discussion and question answers. Thank you.
Thank you, Jyotsna. I have this habit of becoming quite loud, so make sure that if I'm too loud, just raise your hand, so I'll soften and speak more softly. Can you hear me and understand me at the back? No? Yeah? Okay. Now, I'm assuming that quite a few of you may not know what Shimla Convention was all about, or may not be an expert on history and politics of Tibet and international relations. That's the assumption I'm working from. So I'm going to try to balance between what an expert historian may talk about, but also something that a layperson should know about. Broadly speaking, as Jyotsna pointed out, 100 years ago, a treaty or a convention was being discussed between Britain, the British India, Tibet, and China. The reason it's important that it's tripartite convention is to recognize that even China acknowledged Tibet as having treaty-making capacity. Now, only an independent state will have that treaty-making capacity. So the reason why Shimla Convention is so important for Tibetans today is because it's a reminder to the world that Tibet was once historically independent. This is why it's important today. Now, in 1930, the situation was, China and Tibet had a complicated relationship. Most Tibetans did not even know what China is or who Chinese people are. They had a certain kind of relation that was called patron-priest relationship between the senior lamas and the emperors based in China. I say emperors based in China, not Chinese emperors, because they were not Han Chinese, but Manchus or Mongols. Now, from a patron-priest relationship that made sense in religious terms, once the Manchu Empire was overthrown, Tibet declares independence and becomes de facto independent. So it's legally independent, but also practically independent. Now, of course, Tibet manages to do that in 1911, 1912, because at that time, China was in crisis. The Tibetans do it. Now, the British who were ruling India at that point in time, their interest was never independence of Tibet, by the way. It was also not to break up China. British interest was a sort of neutral power in Tibetan Plateau, but without offending China. They didn't want to offend China because they strongly felt that if Chinese, because partly US and Russia would not like China to be broken up. That was the politics at that point in time. So Britain proposed this convention in Shimla on the ground that they are neutral observers and sort of impartial. They said that we want Tibetans and Chinese to come together and discuss what should be the relationship between Tibet and China. Now, at that point in time, to some extent, you have to remember, Tibet was newly independent in formal sense, and they did depend on British. And now the British, they played a very interesting but also dangerous game that did not help Tibetans in the long run. So in public, the three parties, China, Tibet and Britain, they're discussing what is Tibet. Is it part of China? Is it autonomous? Is it suzerainty? Is it sovereignty that China has? That's the discussion. And the broad consensus was that China does not have sovereignty, absolute control, but has suzerainty, some kind of nominal control. But the disagreement was, where does Tibet lie? Where should be the boundary of Tibet be between what was called Outer Tibet, Inner Tibet? So they divided into two. So where would be total control of Dalai Lama's government and only religious control of the Dalai Lama government? So that was the disagreement. Now for India, that was, to be honest, not relevant. What Britain and Tibet did was also sign and negotiate a secret agreement. So this treaty takes place in 1913-1914. So 24th and 25th of March 1914, Britain and Tibet signed a secret agreement without including Chinese, without informing China, in which they signed a boundary deal between British India and Tibet. As part of that British India and Tibet deal, Tawang, which is now Arunachal Pradesh in northeast India, which China claims as South Tibet, was given by Tibet. It was given up by Tibet. Can you get to that now? It was given up by Tibet to British India. Now, for me, the interesting question is, why would Tibet give up land without getting anything in return? And what we see is, and I'm looking at that negotiation that went on. Tibetans did not expect to sign any boundary deal. Tibetan representative Longchen Satra, in fact, he even said that, look, I was not informed that we are meant to sign any boundary deal, so I'm not prepared. The British said, if you don't sign, it will show that you're not friendly to us. So in the end, so there's a lot of detail that one can go on, and I'm not going to detail that, but essentially, Tibetans were bullied into signing a deal. And I say bullied, and I said that in Delhi, a conference earlier this month also. Longchen Satra, even the day before he was signing, he said that his hand was shaking. He didn't want to sign. Right? So, this constant idea that the British kept saying, you have to sign, because that will show that you have friendly intention towards us. So, Tibetans said, we are willing to sign. Can we also add a disclaimer that we are signing in return for promise of goodwill and friendship? And what do the British say? Don't include that in writing. Because if you include that in writing, then the Chinese will claim that we are being biased. So, what we see is British promise friendship, but don't give anything in writing. Tibetans sign on goodwill, but don't get anything in writing. So they give up land, territory of theirs, but have nothing in writing. And it becomes significant later because when the crucial moment arrives, when Britain may and should have helped Tibet, according to that promise, they didn't help. Now I'll move on. So basically Shimla, this agreement was signed, and there was also a trade deal that also didn't help Tibetans, by the way, and I can go into detailed question answer if you're interested. Now India takes over for Britain in 1947. Now Indian claim is very curious. It argued that the McMahon line, which is the name of the border that was signed in 1914, is legitimate. But it refuses to acknowledge Tibet as independent. So India's position was very curious because it's willing to accept the treaty that Tibet signed, but is not willing to acknowledge or push in international community the fact that Tibet had the capacity to sign the treaty. So that hypocritical policy India takes over from Britain. In fact, the argument I am making is India's policy was never post-colonial. It was very much part of the colonial British policy. Now, when push came to shove and China threatened Tibet, India did not help. Even the promise of goodwill and friendship was largely given up. And China, of course, bullies, occupies, and then forces Tibet to sign a treaty in 1951 under duress, which of part of 17-point agreement, under which China and Tibet for the first time acknowledges that it's under Chinese sovereignty. Indian position is, what can we do? We can't do anything. Now in 1954, India and Tibet signed an agreement called Panchsheel Agreement, 5 principles of peaceful coexistence. Some of you may know, some of you may not know. The full name of the treaty is Treaty between People's Republic of China and Republic of India over trade and intercourse between Tibet region of China and India. Now, it's no longer Tibet, but Tibet region of China. But at least Tibet is mentioned as a term. And no treaty, that's the last international treaty that at least acknowledges the name Tibet in its title. No treaty, no agreement, no discussion between India and China since then has ever mentioned Tibet. That's the last treaty. Now, from Chinese perspective, that treaty was important because they wanted to see, for China, it was a disabling. So I was having a discussion with a friend earlier today. It was a disabling treaty because remember, Shimla Agreement had given certain kind of rights to British India and hence India over Tibet. So from Chinese perspective, they wanted to remove those rights. From Indian perspective, the way Nehru sold that treaty to his own people was somehow we are gaining something, when India did not gain anything. It only lost things and had some kind of face saving. Because Nehru at that time did believe that if we give up on Tibet, broadly speaking, then China will realize that we have good intentions towards China and therefore China will be reasonable when it comes to border dispute. As you know, in international relations, these kind of goodwills don't work. And by 1959, Dalai Lama comes into exile because there's a protest and there's a revolt in Tibet. And the revolt in Tibet is not because Dalai Lama encourages it. To be honest, if you look closely into history, Dalai Lama was far from encouraging it. He's the one who wanted to work with China. He wanted, because for him the reason was simple. He did not want bloodshed. He did not want to give up on non-violence. So he worked hard for that compromise to work. It did not work, partly because Chinese are not sincere, and secondly because Tibetans voted with their feet. And this is an important principle to remember, that in the end, in the West, as well as in China, everyone thinks that Dalai Lama has a supreme authority over Tibetan people on how to do things politically. The fact of the matter is, it's Tibetan people who have authority over Dalai Lama on political affairs. So what we saw was Tibetan people protesting and in a sense using Dalai Lama. So Dalai Lama comes to India, and also we very soon see that border dispute becomes even more volatile, and India and China have war in 1962 in which China easily defeats India, takes control over that region of Arunachal, what India calls Arunachal Pradesh, but withdraws from it more or less. Because remember, for China it was not territorial control that was important. It was to remind to India that we'll defeat you, we can defeat you. And secondly, to remind to the rest of the world that India and China are not equal powers, but India is highly unequal and a weak power. And thirdly, to remind the world that India, that claims to be non-aligned and neutral, actually sought help from US and UK, which it did, and therefore is not generally non-aligned. So China succeeded in all its aims, except it didn't threaten India, it only led to militarization of India. Now, coming to today, that border dispute remains unresolved. There's no war on the borders anymore. That's partly because even India has given up on the notion and the realization that the border agreement was signed over the ghost of the disappeared Tibetan state. India has given up on Tibet. And I'll have 3 more minutes. So, what happened was, British India saw Tibet, territorial Tibet, as a kind of buffer vis-a-vis China. Nehru saw Dalai Lama in Tibet as a buffer. So he always encouraged Dalai Lama to go back. So whenever Dalai Lama, who was very young at that point in time, sought Nehru's advice, look, can I work with Tibet? Remember, and he really trusted Nehru. Nehru would say, it's best if you go back to Tibet. Right? And partly because he really believed that Dalai Lama should go back to Tibet. And something which I don't think Dalai Lama himself recognized at that point in time is, Nehru was quite self-interested in terms of Indian foreign policy. Nehru believed that so long as Dalai Lama is there in Tibet, China will not militarize heavily, and therefore borders are safe. And Nehru had this notion, I don't know based on what, but he had this notion that because Tibet is so isolated, China will take maybe 80 to 100 years to actually control Tibet. History proved him wrong very quickly. Now, so we moved from that stage, and now when Dalai Lama comes to exile, so for a few years, even India saw Tibetans in exile here as some kind of buffer, right? But today, most of the Indian thinking, even those skeptical of China, do not really respect Tibet or Tibetans' rights. So you'll never have Indians even talk, or Indian state, to be honest, Indian state talking of human rights of Tibet. Self-immolations have occurred. Not a single statement, if I'm not mistaken, correct me if I'm wrong, has come out of India. The reason for that is very simple. Indian state, in my analysis, and I take full responsibility without responsibility anyone who has hosted me here, Indian state is as unethical and colonial and ruthless as Chinese state. There's some difference, of course, vis-a-vis Tibetans. But when you ask other colonized people, be it Kashmiris and Nagas, they'll think that India and China have no big difference. Now, coming back to Tibet, we saw recently the Indian government, they came up with an excuse that we don't want to criticize Israel over Gaza. You know what the excuse they use? Because Israelis may criticize over Kashmir. Similar argument is used. So basically, Israelis can kill all the Palestinians, it wouldn't matter, so long as they don't criticize us on Kashmir. Similar kind of argument is used with China now. So basically what we see is these big states, India, China, Pakistan, all of them having their own colonies, in case of Tibet, of course, in case of China, it's Tibet, not wanting to criticize each other. Sometimes Indian state may want to use Tibetans to create problems for China, but not even that. And my analysis now is, hope doesn't come from Indian state per se. Hope for me in Indian context, of course. I'm not talking Western context, because even Western states are sold out. Even countries like Norway, right? So which are economically powerful and which have the sort of capacity to antagonize China. Even they have stopped antagonizing China. So I have no hope from the states, but I do have hope from the people. For instance, people who gather here, not only Tibetans but non-Tibetans. That it's responsibility of Indian people and people in the West and people in other parts of the world to recognize that Tibetans exist as people, as a nation. In the end, they have the right to self-determination. Whether Tibetans give up that self-determination in favor of autonomy or their struggle for independence is in the end to be decided by Tibetans, not the Chinese, not the Indians, not the Westerners. So the least we can do is remind ourselves, remind our governments, and remind them again and again that look, Tibetans, like many others, are a people whose rights matter. On that note, I'll end. Thank you.
Foremost of all, my warm greetings to you all, especially to the organizer, Diveshji, for coming all the way here, and all my friends here. First, I'd like to say that I'm not an expert. I'm just a student trying to understand the complexities of our history. So I'll be speaking in Tibetan, and later on I'll speak a little bit just of what I've presented here. I'll be speaking mostly on the treaty itself, how it was signed, the 9 months that had happened during those duration, what had happened, the politics behind the agreement and everything. So let me have the privilege of speaking in my own motherland, Tibetan. Tomandelia Somalia Sandishwani, Tamude Simsuetia, that Yende, Tride Lopuper and Zobagi, the Gubbergia, in Toman Toshnashway, in being under the Kawan the Kaibush me, Logan cheating aging. Together, Bulgaria, Chapsi, the Tonano, Logan to Chedi, and Tarinde, Khan, Shubati, and Naram when it's some show the Kaime, and he mixed Jushiti, and Joy, some of Mambuchik, mixed Pivana, Binet, and the Sharabade, and the Inginolia, H. Jackson, Charles Bell, and Gahana, mixed it, and the Tarangalia, Kawan, Zichi, Daddy, Prashotam, Mera, because the Mambuchik, Tom Shago. Di nalo te je ta dus roxik dus shubei taringi chi di ngadu pebazok gekap chik ranze yembe ge pangda gekap chik yembe soshi nebe düze jiliya kanda ta chi shaba de chik chadi gyore di dizumliya owa ke tari dujen di sunzi chi gwe ki miyu kran dagaran chadi gyore Tandingi Shwezo di Kablia, Joneta, Jamin, Rodeva Kablia, Nezu Karichu, any Dinalo Chashet, Jamaica, Kuzabri, Ram Bebe Kuzabri, Inji Kuzab, Punzuri, Jabjon, any Nezu Chuya Kablia, Shosho, and Nezu Karga, Chapsi, Jabjon Kanidu, the Nezik, Ropsik, the Shuna Samsung. The Manzuman Chindi Sheva Kablia, Dakansaji Sansada, Ngenjum Chati, Sansa di Kara Shubin, Katar Gekab, Chipsun Chirawan Chiki Gekab Chik, Swimmer Tonde, Injita, Yami Shung Yamdu, Shungi Kutam Yamdu, Pumanyam Cheche, and the Gekab Chik, Motone, Chin Shasha, Digi, Tapanda, Ranzi, Gekab Chik, Panda Chuchu. Tande Duzula, Tangrazo, Gekab, Lot Tonda Mambuchi in the Gekab Chiki, Luguna, Tande Chale, Ranzi in the Kungi Chik, Ikjat, Panda, the Dick to Chile. Only in Kung Madame King, Panda, Yume King, and Ranzi Shosha, and the Tony Mare. When you did the Gekab Top Change, Gekab Junju Station. Tim Gage, and the Mijul gave upon Chesham, the Legit Chadigar. In Bene, Tedechalia, Yani, anybody get up with you more check under Nazu Rawanchi, Jacob Hime, number 20 girl. And the Jacob in the main touching the Gaji, Jacob Mamushuchi, long up to look at Jacob and the Lugu wedding, Mang Chechik, makes a Monsignor Jacob Mamuchi to Chadigar. Namely, get on a lot of get up gather go get no lot ne. Sibina get up mountain, get up ginger, shoot ginger, share, want to do it like here for your mother. Get up looking now, get up Shamachi, Zenju Cherry, Zing Ton there, and around them, member Changi, and Yamdi get on a lot of get up Chingy Machine, get up looking now, get up Cherry, Chuan, Zenju Chesha. Point du shall look at Mantayo, did Mandugalia, Pergalia, and Tajik. To the Chilia, Zindu Chayo, the Maris said, the Dick Kunke, Zingaton Taha, Shichubaton, Jacob, Ranze Maris, she had the Dick. He come in on Tani Tamu Meme to the Chadu, and the Tamu Meme to the Jik, Perlia, Perbalia, Tamu Meme, Nizik, and the Dodia. Gavin Muchazen, Zinju Person, the Duke when he may. Get up, looking now, where the Jamichashi should be a money. Get up, looking, go up down to a money. Get up, looking now, where the get up, Ranzing, get up on the nails to shoot the girl. So, similar to Shag and Little Nevacabia, check some of her home to shoot in a deep Cabia, Maduchin, Shabaka, Jabjo, 100 observation. Mazupare, Chin Shabak, Govacabia. Chochin. Kunu Chosumba, Losum Has, Gavan, Anolia, Zenju Shut Has, the Injigi, and that Tayonda, 잡교 월 슈레 파 로사스키 주제 차디거 디밀리아 우르스다 자민냠데 치몽 슈직 인직 샤비 김제 폰 딘데 뉴슈지예요 때문에 무슨 군에 조금 말이야 아니 직 전주다 디데마메 디데 뉴슈지예 벽이 부서 내제 샤드라라 요래 kamwe chole pesha chong chole ya mi mangmi chi yon de je de gi ani nyanga da ma ji do de de ne ju chi ya yo de di ga ya so sa di tambu thoma chole jaga da jing nu so chi se je be shu sha in ji gi shue di simla shu sha jana di london ya so chi se je de chi shu sha दार्जिलिंग में तो है ना गांव दिस न्यू दा या दिजे की चिक तो नहीं आते गोगोरी दिन पे है ये मैंने सिमला लुशु है दी जाजो यहाँ दा चिक खास दा दा दिन आने जो शुरू शादी इंजी की चीज़ों चेवे क्या तो जो नालो लिया तो को थाशा ले देंबा है तो खाई शुरू है हमारे ये मैंने दा कंदा मंगू चिलते हैं ने जो मंगू शुरू चिक जोशा दावा को बड़े की चिक सुमु तो 카마델리아 진다 주베기 세 간다 도마델리아다 진다 주베기 세 디카비아다 좀베카라 안타 판다 디체베카비아 간다 당도 기 뇌제 샤드라라 프랑기 차로 지면다 아니 다는 신기 내론직 다는 신기 센데 가송기 구자 제제 쭉학 수사다 구자 망쇼도 건도르샤 제가야 다간들 공기 이자 결을 누규 이자 대수 전부 나도 나도 학스 제제 근데 지금 아빠제 아니 공기 제베가비야 간다 총문문에 말게 다수도 예 상황이야 한다 당간들이 사제 임마 이 간절히 개혁이 사임바 뒤에 아니 이기적 통해 제 뒤샤다 아니 말레리아 미자 레레기 남기 미 아니 본본미 아니 사제기 미 아니 고바칼이야 아니 슈기마 낭셔가 아니 지게 죄 다는 신 고바칼이 샤된 시샤다 다 된데기 다 이기적 배 제인지 디가기 인지다 다 야나 프랑스 한로 산제 셰르야다 이완 다젠 양을 세지 맞아 공기 이제 그런 양 세지 니마가 세지 슈 최고 제지 나가로 세지 계속 이제 지야 그러면 공교쇼 쓰듯이 그러면 칸이 맞지 셔야지 뭐 나도 셔야도 이제 돈 이제 미리 좀 시켜야 이제 예지기 근데 인지 파지기 정상은 파지가 다음에 아니 이번 딱 그런 거는 또 마셔도 이제도 아니 근데 가시지 마시 배기함도 네 인도 선발이야 뭐래 통교 인도 선발아 아니 배트코라다 간다다 세우시 우측 차죠 인증원에 당하는 다 나라는 쉬어야 다 디급이야 간다다 별이 나와는데 치수이다 난시 처방 먼저 다 주고 때문에 이제 별이 추진이 오지래 다는 신기 별이 선점디 아니 소문문에 뭐 다수도 보도 자유열에 별 나로리아 아니 배점이 정이 내주면 아니 총바다 집에는 리모도 아니 베다 아베다 아니 망미도 쳐다 맞추고 되고요. 다른 시기 별 나로리아 아니 지기 남기 강에다 남내는 돈 제주도에 지중매 다른 시기 또 앞에 거래 별다 감도 해설이야 아니 도쿄 단식이 되게 근접지 보여서지 근데 지 아니 자조가 샤샤 안 딜 프랑스 돈이 매니지면 프랑스 다 이완장 프랑스 라야리아 아니 그래디 아니 돈이 제도 나도에 아니 자기 차셔했어. 안 다음에 신기 단대 선점도 돌려 자원이 물에 메시지 그런 타지도 되시죠. 마세 그런 게 라야리아다. 아니 소고가리아 아니 그 장기스칸 카프라니 아니 캬나리아 나도기 아니 베데 디체레스 마크로 거치요. 다음에 신기 아니 지기 코네디네 피어스 경험을 다음에 신기 아니 지기 지금 이제 실로래 이메네 인지기 아니 베다 마야베 제리아 아니 로 두주 병아링을 봄 레리스 봄 두주 병아 파서 제거야 딜라 아니 준비디 아니 인지기 바냐제 더 가셔던 따디 더 구냐제 디제리아 따디 근접 제제 아니 봄 일상을 시켜 매세야디 만주티 이제 자미기 대셔와 등한주 제레스 디 만주 아니 지게가 만주 임베 복방다 베스지데 셰자 안 딜리아 만지 샤다기 내도 페페스 야고 교나샤 tanda Genghis Khan di sobore ani sobo indu samdi jami zong yin mares an ma gi jabyo che de di yong yu ros lu ju na ma bu yore an tanda alai to cha sha bina tundi ge gap to ma pa do ro che de yor de ne de ge gap di wal cha gi yor des ta na sing gi an chi gi ming sa chi gi khone lo de de di ani ta mo chi gi khone pa cha sha de ma bu yore ta na sing ye ja uru su gi na do khone de yor di na na do uru su wal cha gi yor des ya ta de ne an bum ni zanga di cha rang de sha ma do 하고 보면 또 돼서 좀 좋았어. 티카스 때 거의 한 시지 간다 풍계를 아니 간다 먼저 셔더라 거네. 아니 뱉다 세우 쉬우지 또네 뮤직들이 중샤. 이메는 겸이 거네. 뱉다 지금 디갑이 자나디 또 영시가 오게리아다. 베이징 더 자나프란 로리아다. 교우도 지금 내가 지금 아니 버게리아 타취에 교우도 타마취에 근데 내 파타야리아 유는 어디야나. 그 과거에 얘네 슈슈 쉬우지 가시에 매되게 근데 이내다 돈이 ಬಂದ다 나오고 쉬우지 고나자. 딱 고나 해도 somebody 한달 손도 담에 개쳐서 손도 담에 개쳐서 somebody 아니 진짜 중일이야 강제비 금색 돈이 아니야 손도 참여하고 자시 디카비야 아니 로제 샤다라도 그런 섬에 내자가 스페셜 아니 이번 장과 뭐게 아그라 타즈메일나 아니 뭐게 딜리도 참점 노스도자 다 디파라 등이데 디베스라 소원을 시래 진짜 순백 세 접실라 아니 인지나 아니 자가기 아니 맥마운스야 산다로 자 되는 조샤 다 간다 인지 천다디 치이디 샤고에 금제 뭐 쉬우지 당기 공도 소소 버퍼스에 가면서 인지 선을 넣어야 다 간다 자가 브리티시 라지 인디아 디자베리아 아니 간다 즉 버퍼 스테이트스다 파게기 개갑되는 마무리 조치에 아니 믹스에 동네 제대로 우르수인데 우르수기 직 대수 제변에 직 잡고 해야 되는데 사무직 돈에 아니 우르수 이메일에 디갑이야 또 다른 이는 집에다 아웃 집에 가면실에 되고 다서 이제 배치할 좀 가면 차디요 나도 사무다 이제 사무는 심란치 디포게 되는데 이제 직다 개갑 나중에 뭐 직폰에 근데 레시지 나도 시간 찍겨요 초 심어지는 때 이제 사무는 배치하다 좀 해야 돼 배치로도 나서야 돼 계획이 된게 침묵직 나눠야 계좌 세우 신고서 되는데 돼야지 심란치 거 차대셔 뒤뒤 먼저 누구 프랑이야 뇌야 아니 지금 그래는지 샤드라 예배에 자원이는 물에 문제 자원이는 영화에 뭐 답지도 못 하겠지 유르무 슈치 됐다 배전나샤 예배에 답지 캐말에 우리 영화에 보여마시지야 근데 핸들 맥몬다 인지 구자 판 뉴슈테 아니 프랑이 잡을 수 있는 charles bell나 안테나 아키바 로스트 근데 시제 프랑이 잡을 못 다 단단 아주 두치 때 그 선물이야 이완 찬스에디 아니 아직 근데 개원도 라비 이완 찬스에디 로그라식 런던 아니 인지 때 야나기 쇼자비야 내가 진용에 인지 벤비스 되고 용에 다른 신기 인지 다는 야나기 오pen 마 쇼베가비야 시리지에 근데 나온 용에 다 사자 뭐 쇼를 도체 딱 첩시다 아니 직믹세기 쇼바라 지경다 근데 또 벤비스 장주가 되는데 and Henry Macon lo jimbe sanzam thadu chia tholia ni shuji khawa yede and ta manji shabra lo jimbe na be no chilo che ro manjunge lo yas che and chojo thoni che and yimbe ne ta di kabriya ta chapsi gi and mixe jonda de khaim me be ne jingyon na chapsi da shumde da de ko shu jonda me be ne and quran chali ya shu na be nyamba du chumudu 고추부 슈도 엔 잠링이 도다나 미 케제다 도조토레 캬바시오리 샤세제 그 자스 프랑게 라티도 자스 베르기 딜라 테프즈나 티샤 아니 샤가바이 비나노레 티샤 프랑게 제제 슈샤레 세제 근데 가면주도 디인지 카셰 플라리아 아니 간조 다가는 찹지기 내서 돈에 다 그냥 내가 김생 돈에 아니 고고 테베스야 근데 라빙이 리치도 아니 된다 다 타만 될이야 치 맥몬 디가 타셔셔 그래 맥몬 디기 아니야 되게 사람 뭐 쉬우직다 여기 나와 타마 동로직다 내가 와야 쇼보도 직 찬도 간다 이 타만 유문 될이야 이만 타면 될 천다 제외가 있는데 이만 지금 다 중요면 되지 근데 거기 인지 쇼다를 맞대셔 치 샤베가비야 야미 기 부자 프랑이 다 진짜 시월이야 다 그게 민도 지금만도 전다 되면서 간선의 판에 까져가 와 슝이 까져 전다 되면서 이미 진짜 변변세 숨리야 천다 제백가가 이완장 프랑스의 대샤 딱 아메리카도 프랑스 있잖아 나와야 이 지인들 장본 말에 뭐 왔다네 여기 거기 이완장이 그거야 저와치대 렌 천다 보는 뭐제 지금 아니 두저 가서 아니 프랑스 라야 제백은 다 냠도 대샤 떠니는 양 그래서 근데 이게 같이 뭔지 제대로 이면에 근데 대리 준비 이제 나로 프랑스의 대샤 아니 나 천다 제도서 말했어 이면에 그래서 강에 내려간 뒤에 이제 그런 대샤 많이 돌아야 근데 아주 그거보다 인지보다 천다 잡샤 이내 천다 잡아서 관심을 표시해 이제는 야 대체 그런 거 같이 그거를 어디야 달래로 너 무시면 나와 계시고 되는 지금 중인의 시제다 이제 뒷면으로 나와서 쭉 먹고 지금 내려 제시야 로마도 이제 하마들은 그냥 생각만 되는데 로마도 되게 이면은 전혀 상당히 얘기를 했어요. 그냥 상당히 얘기를 지금 그런게 단단한 다 단단 친샤디 샤는 이모들이야 체에서 쭉쭉이를 가면 좀 온다. 디카운트는 다 프랑스의 교환자의 구리죠. 교환자의 섬의 교환을 그랬잖아. 섬의 교환을 그랬어. 구제 주도성도 차가래야 단도에 다 따라가지. 내주는 그 그렇죠. 이면은 이 랜드 주도 소셜 제일 많이 이제 프랑스야 이게 이기고 아니 이메일에 전달된 저 가수에 전달부터 말이야 깜나서 조전제셔도 전달 먼저 제시가 하는 이메일에 아니 깜때문에 난 무튼이 저래서 답지 조주제 저거 예스 제제 아니 한류 막문이네 바로 시간에 너무 다운 먹어야 이상하게 전주에 그냥 좀 야한 너들 어디야 근데 저 사무단 지금 어떤 무슨 아니 먼저 샤브란 먼저 이메일에 나도 다 우리 저 사이트에 이메일이 이만까지 되고 아니 그냥 제안이 너가 여기 나왔지 다 된다 네 제일 좀만 강에 가도 지나면 천다도 타 주고도 천다 약속만 제자를 때 이제 주동 되려야지 근데 모든 지금 이제 여러 소리 지금 우리 중앙에 주도는 양자 직전하다 즉 배제지 네가 아니야 천다 제자들은 나지 인도에서 말이야 타마타마 될 사람 여기 스타일이 아니 그냥 완전히 정신을 알아서 나중에 막 그래도 두 분이 그러죠. 하면 나오죠. 따지다 그것도 전화 먼저 굉장히 좀 나오게 유셔가 굉장히 정말이야. 딱 야나를 저의 차가 지대에 차도 정말 요 말했어. 나비 요데에 따다는 때 한류 맥몬 칸 제대 주고 나와. 그래서 그들이 저도 뭐 쉬우지 딱 야가와 돌아서 이제 이메일에서 전화는 상당히 가만히 나와요. 시샤스를 제리야 야나는 인증원이 이메일이 뭐 이슈 파스 같다지 같죠. 맞아요. 그 고주사스 근데 다지 같죠. 과연 아니 마다를 그린들 주죠. 그런 나오는 이메일이 셰리야 이 주들 제어 맞도 비만 맞다며 말했어. 아니 제일 전체 저에게도 맞다며 말했어. 아니 같이 라이 제베는 뜻이야. 시라니오 중요 말했어. 그러나 집에는 여러 집자가 있겠다. 여기 제가 쉬게까지 쇼베케다 저거는 난 샤에 디가 기준데. 다나 시기 그런 주가는 되는데 저기 조금 충분히 좋고 지금 쭉쭉으로 좋아져. 이완전도 집에 파도제 배터 저 매우 차고 지금 제대로 근데 디가비야 특별하지 인지를 하셔서 내주죠. 이내는 상당히 타처 매고는 타처 되네 아니 무규제 한적이 다wan이 모든 여기 사정도 나오고 제주에 특별체에 그런 무슨 나셔 되게 강에 망부시고 제제 전에 이제 제가 주고 강에 제제 이가 먼저 모든 제네 담아 되려야 소도로 그런 여기 대사 뭐지 이 먼저 사자가 그냥 같이 제대로 하는 게 근데 여러 개 좋아요 진짜 좋아요 근데 강에 제제 간다 가사를 너무 저도 소샤도 사고나 누구 누구라 나는 신기 아니 제대로 그러다 Charles Bell was in the third one, you should have a study there, only when I was away of Japan, except the rules of the council, Taiwan, the rules of the Wadi, and Taiwan would have said, shake, chair of duty. Indeed, from the kind would you think, Yara, the topic of the Hibede, and I'm really independent Yara, something she had, and something they out which she recovered, something they heard the end of the together, the day of the subject. The day on the room earlier, is new dollars. France and the better, the Halia and the land of the Salmon. But the negative on the attic is a moment to do it out of them.
In English and not better.
So we are discussing an issue that was started by one of the most powerful imperialist and colonial country. And the problem that later inherited by another country which came out of a revolution with the promise of equality and justice for common people, but actually ended up becoming much more colonial, capitalistic, and imperialist. And that is China. And that is China today. And I'm going to speak as a Tibetan. How much and where Tibet is and what do the Tibetans want today? The legacy of the British imperialist colonial country, what it did with Tibet, and how China is continuing to use those divisive policies. I am a Tibetan born and brought up in India. My education is all because of Indian teachers. But I grew up a Tibetan. And I've pledged that I will spend my entire life for the freedom of my country. So this is the voice of the Tibetans. The treaty that we are talking about, the McMahon Treaty and the Simla Agreement, both of them now are being clubbed together. Of course, it happened in a certain context. But we must know that McMahon Treaty was a bilateral treaty signed on the 24th of March in New Delhi. It was a bilateral treaty signed between Tibet and British Empire, based in India. And it was treaty deciding the border lines between Tibet and British India. Similar agreement happened in July, same year, 1914. But that was the treaty to demarcate the borders between Tibet and China. Tibet and China, that was a similar agreement. And this is the divisive policy the British Empire played at that time. But this is not the first time British did anything in Tibet. It was preceded by the British invasion of Tibet led by Colonel Younghusband in 1904. An expedition to find whether there was any Russian influence in Tibet, which actually ended up killing more than 500 Tibetans when they were resisting the British invasion into Tibet. So today when we are looking at these international treaties. Very often, what is missing, as both the two former speakers presented, is Tibet is missing in all these documents. In the year 2006, I went to London, and in one of the Tibetan gatherings, one British member of parliament said, at the time, 2006, said that Britain is the only country that recognizes Tibet as an autonomous region, as an autonomous country in 2006. 2 years after, in 2008, Britain changed its policy altogether and unilaterally said Tibet is a part of China. India is a home, second home for us. It's been very generous for the Tibetans to host us. But it began right from the beginning, from 1950 onwards, following the British pattern of policies towards Tibet. Nehru, who was Oxford University student, continued to follow the British policy towards Tibet. The Nehru government had this dream that they were going to be friends with China, and Tibet anyway didn't have military, political, or economic power. They did not invest any of their interest in Tibet. When I was growing up in Tibetan refugee school, the first lesson that came to me as a young Tibetan boy growing up in school was, the world does not know about Tibet. We need to educate the world. And if we are able to tell the world what is happening in Tibet and the Tibetan desires for independence, the world will support us. This very, very highly romanticized idealism has not changed so much within the Tibetan community. We continue to say, use a language that we are going to get support. We still do not speak the language of international interests, mutual interests. It seems as if we still do not understand international politics. And it's been my personal mission, working as an activist within the Tibetan community, to raise that political awareness and use it in our political activism. India is today the only country in its policy statement says Tibet region or Tibet Autonomous Region is part of People's Republic of China. The significance of this statement and the phrase People's Republic of China is that there is an unsaid, unpronounced recognition of Tibet as an independent country before the formation of People's Republic of China in 1949. So India is the only country who covertly recognizes the historical independence of Tibet. But again, I debate and argue with our Indian friends and say, without giving the explicit historical recognition of Tibet's historical independence, you cannot claim your control or your right over Arunachal Pradesh. Because Arunachal Pradesh is a baby born between the marriage of the British Empire in India and Tibet. And if you do not recognize the father, how do you claim the legitimacy of your child? So India must explicitly declare that Tibet was an independent country. Without that, you cannot claim over Arunachal Pradesh. There's no way. There's no two ways to go about it. There is still a lot of misunderstanding or no clear understanding of the whole origination of the modern day Tibet-China problem. In fact, when we were in school, we were taught that whole Tibet problem started from 1949 when China invaded Tibet. And in India, there is no textbook in India which talks about Tibet as a country, which is India's neighbor, with 4,000 kilometers of border. No Indian textbook talks about it. Therefore, many of my Indian college friends who I studied with in college and in university, they know nothing about Tibet. The problem, the modern day Tibet-China problem, started from 1911. In 1911, China was in such a pitiable situation that China was not only under the Manchu Empire and under Manchu's occupation, that China's some of the most important business centers in the east, so all the ports were cut and divided among European colonial countries. Chinese were not only being occupied and terrorized by the Manchus, they were ruled over economically. They were ruled over economically by the European colonial powers. So just as any oppressed people would do, in 1911, the most patriotic Chinese from 17 different provinces came together and created what is called the Xinhe Revolution, 1911. They not only overthrew the Manchu rulers, they created a united China. And this was the birth of modern day China. The promise of China. In 1912, Republic of China was recognized. Republic of China was declared as the government of New China. And this is the same name which, after the failed fight for power with Mao Zedong, Chiang Kai-shek took this government to Taiwan. So today, Taiwan's government continues to be known with this name, Republic of China. So Republic of China, the name, was born in 1911. And People's Republic of China was born in 1949 with Mao Zedong as the supreme leader of all over China. So it was in 1911 where the problem began between the Chinese and the Tibetans. Chinese, at the time, because they had overthrown the Manchus, they attempted, now this is the most important stage of all the history, Chinese attempted to do what is called inheritance of power. Just as the Manchus overthrew the Yuan dynasty, the Mongolians, and inherited the power by the Manchus, Chinese also attempted to do the same thing. Because they overthrew the Manchus, they tried to inherit powers over people and land over Mongolia, over Manchuria, of course, and East Turkestan and Tibet. So they tried to send military invasion into Tibet. That resulted into the 13th Dalai Lama having to escape into India because of Chinese attempt to invade Tibet. This was the first incident where the Dalai Lama had to escape into India. And the 14th Dalai Lama escaping in India, 1959, was the second time. It was the first one, 1911. So, because they failed to invade Tibet and occupy, it remained in the psychology of every Chinese to say, we have a moral or historical claim over Tibet, and it could not be accomplished at that time in 1911 and 1912. And later, His Holiness the 13th Dalai Lama returned to Tibet, and as the two speakers earlier said, the rest is history. But the Chinese people continue to have this psychology in their mind that they have right over Tibet. One of the other reasons and how history has been reinterpreted to engineer the rise of People's Republic of China and engineering the entire 8.6 million square kilometer of land which is China today is constant reinterpretation, refurbishing history. Where today China says Manchuria was not a separate and different country. Manchuria was one of the provinces of China, and Emperor of Manchuria was one of the emperors of China, and he was corrupt and he was overthrown. And therefore, Manchuria is nothing but a province of China, and the whole history of Manchuria, therefore, is the history of China. Now they claim similar control over narratives of Mongolian history. So China's history and land continues to grow bigger and bigger. And therefore, because there was a treaty between the Mongolians and the Tibetans, of Tibetans offering religious teachings to the Mongolians and the Mongolians giving military protection to Tibet, that treaty China is using today to say that Tibet had ceded its political control to China at that time in 1720. So China keeps on refurbishing history, keeps on reinterpreting history, but knack of everything is China today has a military power, economic power, and political power. Therefore, most of the countries around the world today gives that kind of political legitimacy to China only for their own interests, their economic interests. And this is we need to understand. And as a Tibetan today, in conclusion, I'm saying that we, the younger generation Tibetans, because we are the stakeholder of future Tibet, I'm saying, deal with us. Because tomorrow's Tibet will not have the Dalai Lama's compassion to deal with you. We will deal with you as you are dealing with us today. And it's such a bad miscalculation to think that after the Dalai Lama, Tibet will not be there. I think Tibet will rise only after the Dalai Lama. And that will be the true rise of the Tibetan voice. And therefore, whether it's India, Nepal, or Bhutan, or any of our neighboring countries, or countries as far as America or UK, our message to them is deal with us equally as you want to be dealt with tomorrow when Tibet is free and independent. Thank you.
Excuse me, please don't camera me because I'm back home Tibet. That's why it's quite a privacy. My question is that actually I don't know my question is valid or is it deep thinking, or I'm just curious about that because I read a quite good number of books. Actually, when I saw that the stem, the Marx stem, actually we Tibetan government using the stem as second one, Gogo, and one the Mongma line stem that is a square. Actually, the Chinese government they use the square stem, and now when I see this stem, I thought that on that time the Lojong Shastri was really carrying the stem of Gandhi Podam, of His Holiness stem, or this is partial Tibetan. Actually, it's the partial Tibetan, like Lojong Shastri is under the Chinese, or Lojong Shastri get a pressure from Chinese, or because we Tibetan doesn't agree of 70-point agreement. Chinesen Chukking we not agree that. Because on that time, on that 70-point agreement, we Tibetan use a square stem. And on that square stem, all the letter is like a parallel. If you see today's the His Holiness Dalai Lama office, the every stem is Sagron. Every letter is Sagron. So I mean, my question is this stem is Gandhi Podam stem, or is legitimate, or what? Thank you.
We'll take 2 more questions and then we'll answer them together at the same time because we have only 15 minutes. Anybody else?
Hi, I was wondering if you could just flesh out the argument for Tibet being legally an independent state before the Simla Agreement.
My question is to Professor Anand. I was wondering if you could relate what you said about the Simla Agreement to the argument you make in Geopolitical Exotica about the exoticization of Tibet, and if that sort of played into, what was happening, especially vis-a-vis British interests in Tibet.
First question about the stamp. I mean, it's very interesting from my reading of the British document, for instance, right? And first, I don't think this whole idea that Lojong Shastra and others may have been influenced by the Chinese or somehow were being unpatriotic would be a very wrong argument to make. What we need to acknowledge is that the leaders at that point in time, be it Shimla Agreement or 1951, they were under a lot of immense pressure, not only from the Chinese, but also competing powers within the monastic body. So it's not that so they were under a lot of competing pressures, right? And so it seems somehow that it's somehow a Chinese conspiracy to some extent and Longchen Shau's part would be very ahistorical. What was happening, because it's very clear that all these agreements, including the one signed on 23rd, 24th, or 24th, 25th of March, he did get approval of Dalai Lama, he did get approval of the 3 big monasteries, and there were couriers going from India into Tibet, Lhasa, and coming back. Now, I don't know whether he carried the stamp or whether it was stamped in Tibet and then was sent back, but it was very clear that now the people who were not consulted were those aristocrats who owned estates in Tawang region. They were not consulted. And the explanation provided by 13th Dalai Lama was, we do not have enough time to do it. And if we consult them, they may oppose right now. So let us give up this region because British have promised us that friendship, and British have promised us that in return they are going to help us vis-a-vis China. So from my perspective, stamps were, at least I am talking the Shimla part, were legal, it was authentic, it was approved by the government in time. Later, of course, even 13th Dalai Lama did not approve. That's partly because, according to him, Longchen Chatra failed to get British to pressurize the Chinese to sort of agree on inner outer Tibet. Now, in terms of Tibet being illegally independent, I mean, see, the onus, I'll answer that, but the onus is on China to prove that it has sovereignty over Tibet. Not for an entity to prove that
it was independent. Of course, the sad matter is that Tibetans have to prove it because they're the weaker power here. But the fact is, when you look at Chinese claim of sovereignty, and I guess that's my next book is on how China claims. Very interestingly, they'll always say that Tibet has always been part of motherland for 5,000 years or whatever. They come up with 3,000, 5,000, a lot of years, right? Yet, when another part of Chinese public diplomacy and propaganda is, they'll say old Tibet was oppressive, horrible, feudal part. Dalai Lama was this tyrant and he liberated Tibet. The basic question is, if Tibet was always part of China, then who did the Chinese liberate Tibet from? Right? So the responsibility of all the oppression lies with the Chinese, not with the Dalai Lama. But those two contradictory narratives are integral to the Chinese rule. The Chinese will claim liberation. So on 28th of March every year for last 3-4 years now, China celebrates in Tibet Serfs Emancipation Day. Now, of course, after 50 years or 60 years, they remember that Serfs have to celebrate their own emancipation. But of course, the Serfs, so-called, the Tibetans, have no right to, have no freedom and no right to decide whether they want to celebrate or not. Now, in terms of independence, see, in my own analysis, you see that Tibet used to have a very complicated relation with empires based in China, especially the Manchus, who were ethnically different, and remember they were Buddhists, and the Mongols, who were also Buddhists. So if today, for instance, People's Republic of China becomes Buddhist Republic of China, maybe they'll have a better claim over Tibet than they would have in the People's Republic of China. But of course, if they become Buddhist Republic of China, then they'll no longer be People's Republic of China. Because as you know, People's Republic of China is Party's Republic of China, not actually People's Republic of China. Now the final, and I'll leave Sundula to make the point about legally independence part. Going back to the exoticization part. Now, the British policy at that point in time was very clear that they wanted least cost involved. So, until 1904, when British invaded Tibet, they always presented Tibet as this ruthless place, dirty place, backward people who need a civilized hand of Britain. They invaded Tibet, they defeated and killed Tibetans, then they had to withdrew, mainly because of geopolitics between Russia and Tibet, so Russia and Britain and China in Europe, nothing to do with Tibet. Now, once they withdrew, they realized that exoticizing them helps because by presenting them, one more argument was, there were British officials and other officials who said, let us encourage free trade in Tibet. Let us allow Tibetans to trade freely with Japanese and Russians. That would allow Tibetans to be more free. And the British said, no. In fact, backward, we have to keep Tibet isolated. Because backward nature of Tibet suits our interests and also Tibetan mentality. So you see very clearly that Britain deliberately did it, and that was through exoticizing Tibet as this kind of mythical Shangri-La, La La Land, where lamas can fly into there if they want to. But in terms of practical politics, they wouldn't know. And the real impact today of that exoticization was in 1950, that even when they would pay lip service to rights of Tibetans, they never said political rights of Tibetans. They said religious rights. So because Tibetans are so religious, that was the exoticization part, that Tibetans are so religious, they just give them religious rights. They can't handle politics. So one impact of this exoticization was reducing Tibetans' issue into a religious issue, reducing Tibet into Dalai Lama's personal status issue, and not seeing Tibetans as colonized people who have the right to self-determination.
Well, one of the most important legal proofs of any independent country is that certain population needed to be living in that land for a certain period of time. And India's claim over Arunachal Pradesh, one of the reasons India gives is that since 1951 onwards, India has absolute control over Arunachal Pradesh up until today. So without going to historical background, India says that since 1951 onwards, up until today, India had absolute control over Arunachal Pradesh and doesn't really go into history. In that case, since 1642, when the 5th Dalai Lama ascended and became the overall ruler of Tibet. Of course, there had been military invasions, attempts to fight, sometimes with the Gurkhas, sometimes Ladakhis, sometimes even from the Sikh, and also 1904 British invasion. These kind of things happened, but up until 1914, if you are looking at that demarcation of time, Tibet had remained an independent country. There was no occupation from any side or any country as such. Tibet remained an independent country. So independent that it remained in isolation. And towards later, when China invaded Tibet, it was the isolation that cost us so much. Diplomatically, we couldn't build that kind of relationships to receive that kind of return support from any of our neighboring countries. The question about the stamp that was used here in the McMahon Treaty, the Simla Agreement, and the difference between that and the 1951 17-point agreement, you wanted to know, and it's an important observation. If you actually look at the 1951 17-point agreement, which was imposed upon by the Chinese on the Tibetans, most importantly, the 5-member delegation in Beijing in 1951 was sent by the government of Tibet to discuss. They didn't have any authority to make any decision. Forget about signing treaties. And because they did not have official authority to sign any treaties with them, such kind of stamps were not issued to them. And if you actually look at the document which Chinese government reprints in newspapers and in all their propaganda machinery, you will see that there are 5 small stamps with names of the 5 people, only names. There are 2 with spelling mistakes. Yeah, you actually get to see that. There are spelling mistakes. So these named stamps were created in Beijing because these 5 officials didn't have any official stamps with them. So firstly, they didn't have authority to sign any treaty. Secondly, because they didn't have any stamps with them, stamps in the name of these officials were created and those were used. So today, Chinese government is going about everywhere and showing these documents, not knowing that there are spelling mistakes contained in these documents. The importance of this Lönchen Shada, because he was an official, in official position, he held the position in Tibet, and he was sent to make such an important decision. So therefore, he was carrying the stamp of his own stature with him. Another thing, the difference between those 2 stamps, the fake one and this original one used in 1914, is traditionally in Tibet, there is no culture of any stamps made in the name of the person. It's always in the status or the official position these officers were holding. So therefore, you see a stamp of such a grandeur design here. And in 1951, the stamps were only in individual names written in Tibetan. Thank you.
Let me just add a few more clarifications. I think there should be no doubt about the authenticity of the stamp because the so-called McMahon Agreement was secretly signed between just Tibet and the British representatives. There weren't any involvement of the Chinese. Especially Iwan Chan or the Chan Yifan was in a very awkward position. He wasn't in a very strong position when the treaty was being discussed. So I don't think there should be any doubt about the authenticity of the stamp. Regarding the Tibet's status as an independent nation, if today the proof of a nation being independent has to be that there shouldn't be any foreign occupation, then I think there won't be even a single nation remaining in the United Nations amongst the 198 nations. There are always, whenever you check out the history of any nation, there will be foreign occupations, some spanning around thousands of years, hundreds of years, 500, 200 years. But to make it very clear that Tibet was never occupied for even 50 years. The cases of foreign occupation, the so-called Chinese suzerainty or sovereignty over Tibet, is just in a verbal cases. You don't have a Chinese emperor or a military stationed at Lhasa and ruling Tibet for more than 50 or 100 years. This has never happened. So the argument that Tibet should be free of any foreign occupation is a gross injustice for the Tibetan people. If that should be the case, then there won't be any nation remaining on the United Nations as an independent nation. Some nations have cases of foreign occupations of thousands of years, nations, around 60 different nations ruling that territory. So those shouldn't be argued. Tibet existed as an independent nation for thousands and thousands of years, managing its own affairs without any external pressure and influences. Whenever Tibet has fought a war, whenever it fought a war with different nations, Ladakh, Sikkim, Kashmir, China, British, it had fought on its own. There aren't any support from the Chinese Empire. They never came to rescue us when the British conquered or invaded Tibet in 1904. So looking at these different instances, one would infer that Tibet was an independent nation, because there were cases when the British and the foreigners started believing that Tibet could be a suzerain of China, and they started seeking permission from China, from Beijing or Peking or Nanjing, to go into Tibet, and it was found that they were not allowed inside because Lhasa manages its own affair and its borders. There were many, many cases, many, many botanists coming into Tibet, many missionaries. They got permission at the end from the Lhasa government itself. And then we have, as a nation, signed different international treaties. Treaties, some of them are 821 AD, Tibet signed a treaty with China. 1642, it signed a treaty with Kashmir. 1681, it signed a treaty with Bashar, Raja Kahar Singh, that is with the 5th Dalai Lama. 1683, it signed a treaty with Ladakh. 1842 with Maharaja Ranjit Singh of Ladakh. 1856, it signed a treaty with Nepal. 1904 with the British. 1912 with China. 1913 with Mongolia. 1914 with British. And the fourth treaty that was signed under duress, 1951. Tibet remained a neutral nation during the First World War, as well as Second World War, whereas China was involved in those world wars. It has the capacity and the power to remain neutral despite of so much, allied politics around. So these are some of the instances where we could derive that it has existed as an independent nation. It has its own governmental system. Some people say that it's a theocratic, but it does involve lots of public, representations in the form of monks, in the form of nobles. And then people started saying that there's a prison in Potala, and if you really see, those prisons are meant for the noble people, not for the masses. You'll find very less common people being imprisoned and tortured, more so in political intrigue involving the royal families. So there are many, many cases. So it would be gross injustice to say that Tibet doesn't deserve independence. There are many scholars, many thinkers, many historians today saying that it seems Tibet belongs to China, or it doesn't have the sovereignty. So if we talk about truth, justice, freedom, it should be equal to all the people of the world. So Tibetans do deserve whatever they aspire for. And then when we have a self-determination, so-called self-determination in the United Nations, it does imply for us too. Thank you.
I think we don't have time for any more questions, but thank you for your questions and thank you to the speakers for some very meaningful insights into the Shimla Agreement and its relevance and significance today. Before you guys leave, I would like to urge you to have a look at some of the documents here. We have some newspaper clips which reported the Shimla Agreement in 1914. So these articles, small snippets of information are from newspapers published in 1914. And there is also an image of the McMahon Line signed by the representatives of British India and Tibet, and a photograph of the Tibetan and the British Indian and the Chinese delegation. On behalf of Students for Free Tibet and of the Tibetan community, I would like to ask Golok Jigmela to present khatas to our speakers. Just a brief comment on Golok Jigmela. He is a true inspiration. He played a very prominent role in the making of Leaving Fear Behind, which is a documentary film made by Tibetan filmmaker Thundup Wangchen with the support of Golok Jigmela. He was imprisoned thrice and just escaped into exile a few months ago. So Golok Jigmela, please. Yeah, and I want to thank all of you for wanting to know about the Shimla Agreement, wanting to know what it means for India and for Tibet today. Thank you.